Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate your waiting through the challenging parking situation. We had a lot of last-minute sign-ups for this event, so we're delighted to have such a full house and probably have a few more folks arriving. But I want to say thank you for coming to this important event. Thanks to the folks who are watching us live online and in recorded version. This is, of course, an NC Policy Watch Crucial Conversation. We have some wonderful partners helping to sponsor the event with us today. I want to call your attention to a couple of things this morning. One is that NC Policy Watch has gone through some exciting growth recently. We now have four full-time reporters working on staff, wow, which is very exciting. They're all out reporting the news right now. Billy Ball, our education reporter, has been doing fabulous stuff. We have Joe Killian, who was a longtime political reporter for the Greensboro News and Record, who is now our investigative reporter. Lisa Sorg, who was a longtime reporter with IndyWeek, as you know, has been our environmental reporter now for the last couple of months and has just been cranking out stories. She had a very interesting get yesterday about the deposition of the governor's chief of staff and the coal ash matter. So y'all might want to check that out. And just last week, we've added Melissa Boughton, who is our new courts, law, and democracy reporter. She'll be reporting on those very subjects for the time to come. So it's been a delight to have them all, add them to the staff. We also have Nell Dunlap, who is our new media director, who's recording the event today, making our websites look awesome and adding lots of new exciting features to the Policy Watch websites. And of course, the old standbys, Clayton Hinkle, my colleague, who's our communications coordinator, produces Chris's radio show and makes all of our emails go out and just basically holds the whole organization together. And the staff growth has been so exciting recently that Fitzsimon, for like the first time since I can remember, is actually not working this week in the office. So he's not here. This is the man who's up at 4 o'clock every morning reading every newspaper in the state, and who's probably texting me right now, even though he's theoretically on vacation. But that's why Chris isn't here today. I'm Rob Schofield. I help Chris kind of manage the shop at NC Policy Watch. There's lots of websites I want to call your attention to today. There's a palpable sense, I think, of excitement right now. We've got the election happening in North Carolina. Although we are proud of our nonpartisan, rigidly nonpartisan status, we, of course, are very interested in the election. We want to encourage people to participate, to know the issues that will perhaps influence their decision-making in the election process. So there's lots of websites I would call your attention to. The ncvoterguide.org, which is a Common Cause website. NC Justice Center, our colleagues, have an Election 2016 website, which will link, and that's also highlighted on some of the little flyers and buttons on your table. Of course, our website, ncpolicywatch.com. I want to mention our two partner organizations that are helping to co-sponsor today's event. We have North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections, that's ncvce.org. Melissa Price-Crom, the director right there, welcome her. She does a great job with Voters for Clean Elections, and they are a critical voice for good government in our state. And of course, commoncausенc.org are our other co-sponsors for today's event. Bob Phillips, the executive director, sitting back there, as well as Brian Warner on the camera, and Brent Lorenz, and Jane Pinsky with the Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform, which is, of course, a part of Common Cause North Carolina. And then Jane wanted me to make sure you saw this website going up the board here, gerrymanderingnow.org. That's another one you should check out. Lots of important discussions going on right now, and our partners, so I want to call your attention to those. I want to introduce, however, our speaker to you today. We're very lucky and excited to have Karen Hobert Flynn, who's the president of Common Cause, the national nonprofit watchdog Common Cause. And I actually came up with this title for her speech. I think she thinks it's okay. How do we repair our broken democracy? I think it's because that's what I would like to know, so I just selfishly made that the title of her talk today. But Karen is shares these concerns that we have as president of Common Cause, an organization dedicated to holding power accountable. She is acutely aware of the deep problems that confront the American experiment in the 21st century. And fortunately, she remains optimistic about what we can do to overcome the enormous challenges that we face, that our democracy faces. And she's going to address us today about those issues. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's been with Common Cause for a long time. As Senior Vice President for Programs and Strategies, Karen led the program and development of Common Cause from 2012 to 2016. During that time, she oversaw the strategy and planning for the organization and raised significant resources to support their national and state efforts to curb the outsized influence of big money in politics and to protect voting rights. She launched Common Cause's campaign to expose and stop the dangerous movement in the states for a constitutional convention that would put in jeopardy every constitutional right or protection currently available to American citizens. She oversaw a dramatic expansion of Common Cause's digital presence, bringing in hundreds of thousands of new members and supporters. And as Vice President of States from 2007 to 2012, Karen expanded Common Cause's state presence to include Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Oregon, Ohio, Florida, Vermont, and Hawaii. And obviously she speaks and writes frequently on the issues affecting our democracy, including money in politics, voting rights, and ethics for elected officials. And of course, she's in all the major news media outlets around the country. And it's been a wonderful new addition to have her as the new president of Common Cause National. And we're just thrilled she's in town. She's been here for a couple of days with the local folks, and she's going to share some of her thoughts with us right now. After she speaks, we'll have time to go around and take your questions and share them with the group. So please join me in welcoming Karen Hobert Flynn.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure everyone can hear me in the back of the room.
No, you need a mic.
We've got a mic
I've
on
got
her.
a mic.
Maybe
Let
we'll
me
hold
move
it up a little higher.
How's that? Is that any better?
Yeah, I think that helps.
Okay. It's held with a paper clip. That's how I know. I'm among friends in the nonprofit space. So, first I want to thank Jim Goodman, Rob Schofield, Chris Fitzsimon, and NC Policy Watch for inviting me here today to talk about Common Cause and our work directly, facing many challenges in our democracy. One of the first things I wanted to tell you about me is I've been doing this work. I started work with Common Cause back in 1985, working at the national organization, and I spent 10 years, more than 10 years, working at the state level in Connecticut. And so I am the first president of Common Cause that came from working at the state level. And I see the incredible importance of working on democracy reforms at the state level, and the work that Jane and Bob and Brian and others do here, including our volunteer board members, Dennis Burns and others. That work is so important, and it's often overlooked by national media and others. And so I see my work moving forward at Common Cause as really focusing on the democracy challenges that we face at the state level. In Congress, it can be very difficult to get much done in this era of real polarization and asymmetrical polarization, frankly. We're a nonpartisan organization, but we have seen the right move so far to the right that many of our friends, Republicans, have wondered where their party has gone. And so it has been a real challenge as we try and work in a nonpartisan way to bring people on the right, left, and middle together around democracy solutions. But I also keep in mind that 49% of those that come to Congress started here at the state level. And they worked in state legislatures and made their way up to Congress, and those relationships that they have with people on the ground focusing on democracy really matters. Just to give you a little background on Common Cause, and I've been president for 14 weeks, even though I have spent more than 25 years in Common Cause. We have state chapters in 35 states. We have 625,000 activists and growing. We've nearly tripled the number of activists that we've had just over the last 2.5 years. And if people want to ask questions about that, I can talk about it. No one today will feel good about our democracy right now. There are, if you look at this presidential race where we have candidates talking about things that makes you feel like you're in some kind of nightmare from reality TV, it's a real challenge. And we need to remember that even 240 years ago, it was an imperfect union that was formed from the start because the Constitution plainly denied full rights to slaves and women, and therefore they weren't full participants in this democracy. So we need to remember that this work that we are doing, fighting for democracy reform, is built off of the work of abolitionists and those that fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, to the rise of Black Lives Matter. And the story of America is about working to make a stronger democracy that lives up to the promise of what our ideals are. So over our history, people have fought and died for the right to vote, because the vote can be a power of what to say in politics, and it's about our future, our family's future, our income, our economy, our schools, and so many issues that affect people's lives. People have sacrificed their lives to ensure that the generations that followed had the opportunity to keep expanding democracy's reach, working together to increase participation and continuing to break through barriers so that all people can pursue our own notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we really have a long way to go. We have seen that the issues of inequality and intolerance are as much of a threat to democracy as the lack of freedom or the inability to vote. And we've also seen the link between concentrated wealth and the ability to purchase political power and influence poses a major threat to our democracy. Campaign spending in each cycle has ratcheted up and broken new records, and that's thanks in part to the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United a few years ago. The Supreme Court's ruling in striking down the Voting Rights Act, key parts of the Voting Rights Act, have also brought about a wave of vote suppression measures cropping up in states that we've had to fight back against. And these threats to our democracy are exacerbated by the largest income and wealth gaps in a century. We have widespread economic insecurity and persistent racism and poverty. In addition, as America's population changes, our government too often looks less and less like the people it represents. In other words, our democracy is not a reflective democracy. According to the Women's Donor Network and their Reflective Democracy campaign, they took a look at how many people serve in elective office, and that's from local offices all the way up to president. And there are 42,000 elected officials in this country. 90% of them are white, even though 37% of our population is made up of people of color. In a country where men make up 49% of the population, 71% of the elected officials are men. And so that means women only make up 29%, and of that 29%, only 4% are women of color. So part of our democracy agenda needs to be breaking down barriers that block women and people of color from participating in elected office. Despite these challenges, we need to remember that democracy is not a destination where one day you arrive. It is constant work and challenges. And that it is the work of, it's not for the short-winded. This is work that citizens must engage in and be part of moving forward. And, you know, Common Cause was founded 50 years ago by John Gardner. And he founded it, he was a Republican that worked for the Johnson administration, and he headed the Health, Education, and Welfare federal agency. And he did it because he said everybody's organized but the people, and that in many ways that it's about citizens' engagement in the process and the structures of democracy to make sure that they work for everyone. And that work is the work that we've done, and why I believe Common Cause's work is needed now more than ever. We've had a remarkable track record of success dating back to 1970 when we first started. And I remember a columnist that was talking about one of our state organizations said, you know, talk about Common Cause, talk about an overachiever. The chapter of Common Cause, the Citizens Advocacy Group, has only 6,000 members. Yet to varying degrees, it has been behind some of the most far-reaching legislation on government ethics and campaign funding in the past several decades, and enjoys a profile that rivals advocacy groups with much larger memberships and bigger budgets. And the reason for that is we work in coalition in any of the work we do with voting rights groups, with AARP, with League of Women Voters, and many other groups to work on the democracy reforms. And so that work to break down barriers so people can see what happens in their government, passing transparency laws, freedom of information laws so people can get information about what their government is doing, campaign finance and ethics and lobbying laws, conflict of interest laws, election laws. Those are some of the things that we've done. But we've also seen moneyed interests push back against those reforms and roll back many of those achievements over time. And so given that and this moment that we see ourselves in, one question I get all the time is there any hope? And I believe that there are several reasons for hope. First, when you look at surveys and focus groups at the rising American electorate, and that's made up of young people, people of color, unmarried women, they will be the majority of voters for the first time, and quite possibly for the first time in 2016. From polling and messaging work, we see that these voters are less ideological and see democracy reform issues as important to preserve the people's voice. In fact, these voters respond to an agenda that addresses the economy of everyday Americans and promises a more responsive and effective government, especially a government not corrupted by huge corporate campaign spending. And this new American majority can make a difference in the 2016 elections and elections beyond, particularly here in North Carolina on issues like gerrymandering and voting rights. Also, if you look at polling, unlike any time in our history, we have seen voters across the ideological spectrum understand their voice is threatened if democracy doesn't work. And so we've seen polls that show 80% support from Republicans, independents, and Democrats who want to fundamentally change or completely rebuild our campaign finance system. We've seen that same level of support around gerrymandering reforms and many other democracy issues. The other thing that gives me hope is that we are seeing that the states are leading in reform. Despite the major efforts since 2010 to push back, to push restrictive voting measures in states where we see you need to provide proof of citizenship or photo ID, we've actually started to turn the tide at the state level. So let me just give you an example. In 2016 legislative sessions across the country, we saw 422 bills introduced that broke down barriers to participation. Things like online voting registration, same-day voting registration, and measures that go after photo ID and instead expand the kind of IDs that could be acceptable at a polling place. And meanwhile, we only saw 77 bills to restrict access. Just a couple years ago, we saw 20 bills that were breaking down barriers and hundreds of bills introduced. Not only that, we are seeing courts come in and rule and strike down these restrictive measures. So just in the past few months, we've seen states like your own here in North Carolina, Kansas, Michigan, Texas, Wisconsin, and North Dakota strike down photo ID laws or proof of citizenship laws. And just yesterday in Illinois, an appellate judge halted a lower court's decision to get rid of same-day voter registration in Illinois. So within 72 hours, that appellate court judge reversed that decision. So in Illinois, Illinois voters can register on election day and vote, which is a big step forward. We've also seen measures move in states that break down barriers to participation, and by bipartisan, with bipartisan support. So we've seen 39 states plus the District of Columbia pass online voter registration. We've seen 13 states in the District of Columbia now have same-day voter registration, which is it's a safety measure, a safety net for people whose names may have been purged or there have been other problems that leading up to election day. And we've seen 5 states move automatic voter registration, which actually shifts the burden so that people don't have to worry about registering if they register a car or do anything at the DMV, they're automatically registered, and they have the option to opt out if they'd like. And in those states that have passed that, they're also going to look at other agencies, so social service agencies, so that you're capturing people and populations that may not have any dealings with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So, and I can remember several years ago saying to our staff, I want to set a bold goal that by 2020, we can move automatic registration in 5 states. Well, we've already done it by 2016, and we have seen 29 states introduce bills to do automatic registration. So as states start to move this forward, I think that we'll see others do that. In the area of gerrymandering reform, we have a strong ruling, this is one of the few strong rulings that we like from the Supreme Court, around the constitutionality of a citizens commission to draw district lines. This was an Arizona case just last year, rather than having incumbent state legislators draw the maps. And the infamous RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wrote the opinion for the majority and said that the animating principle of our Constitution is that the people themselves are the originating source of all powers of government. That should not be vested in incumbent legislators. It's about the people. And to us, that gives us great hope. We actually see that, that litigation striking down illegally drawn maps have been gaining a foothold. So we have had successes in many places around litigation, which is why the National Office of Common Cause has brought a federal lawsuit against North Carolina's partisan gerrymander. You saw that, not long ago, the court had ruled striking down the racial gerrymandering that happened in North Carolina. So legislators redrew districts, and it looks remarkably similar. And so one of the things that we believe is that this Supreme Court is ready to hear a case and believe that partisan gerrymanders are unconstitutional. So we believe that this will give a great opportunity to learn what Republicans were up to when they were drawing those district lines, that draws attention to the issue as Common Cause North Carolina and many of their allies are working on redistricting reform here in the state. We also see the victories around gerrymandering reform in Ohio just in 2015, and in Florida where they passed this constitutional amendment setting standards for gerrymandering. And we had to go to court around those districts, and the judge used many of the districts drawn by Common Cause and the League of Women Voters because those were much fairer maps. We've also seen in the area of money and politics an explosion of efforts to look at small donor public financing and strong disclosure reforms. They have cropped up at the municipal level, at the state level, and it's an issue that I care about deeply. It's one that I helped move in Connecticut when I was executive director. And what it meant is the candidates, if they work hard and reach out to voters and raise small contributions, can get the resources they need to run for office free of special interest money. We passed it with bipartisan support, a Republican governor, and with Republican support in the House and Senate, and leadership by the Democrats in the House and Senate. And it still enjoys 70+% participation with Republicans and Democrats running for office. And it means that new candidates can emerge from communities of color. We see more women running. They can run for office based on the strength of their ideas and not whether they're personally wealthy or connected to special interests. They also govern differently. And we saw an amazing amount of reforms passed in Connecticut because special interests weren't there to block them. And if anybody has questions, I could talk about that a little more. The last reason that I see real hope for us moving reforms in democracy areas is that we have seen many organizations that don't work on democracy reform, environmental groups, women's groups, and many others say, we can't get done what we need to get done unless we also focus on democracy issue. So there are coalitions springing up. One is the Democracy Initiative in Washington, D.C., that was brought together by the NAACP, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, the CWA, which is the Communications Workers of America, saying that we're going to focus on money in politics and voting rights because we cannot get our agenda through if we aren't working on democracy reform issues. So the idea that John Gardner started about everyone's organized but the people, you know, the challenge we face is these kinds of issues are issues where you have to take on power. And so these are not easy things to win. Sometimes they're multi-year campaigns. The campaign to pass small donor public financing in Connecticut took 10 years to do. But they're important, and they can't be done if we aren't working in coalition and engaging citizens to put pressure on their elected officials to listen and be accountable. And I believe we must show that citizens acting together can take on power and win, and I believe that's really possible. So I'll open it up for questions.
Well, I'll get to ask the first question, which is, perhaps you could say a little bit more about the gerrymandering lawsuit that talks about specifically partisan gerrymandering, which had long been sort of a refuge for the architects of these maps. They were open about the fact that they were gerrymandering in a partisan way and saying, well, that's all been okay and that's approved, and so it's not doesn't run afoul of the Constitution to gerrymander for partisan. So, for instance, of course, here in North Carolina, where we have a 50-50 purple state, and even a majority, perhaps, of Democrats voting in congressional elections, we have a 10-3 split in our congressional map, and similar numbers in our state legislature. Can you say a little bit more about that and why that's maybe breaking some new ground and what your hopes are for that?
I think one of the challenges that we've started to see is there was an attitude to the victor goes the spoils. So whoever takes office and that are in charge in a state, the Democrats in Maryland, in North Carolina, the Republicans, that they get to draw the district lines. What we've seen is huge technological advances in this mapping, and where they can map where voters are, where they live, how much they participate, and they can draw these map lines with such precision that what we've seen is wildly skewed maps. And frankly, I think North Carolina is the poster child for that with the 10-3 split. It really is. And the interesting thing is there have been a number of gerrymandering cases that have made its way up to the Supreme Court, and we have seen Justice Kennedy in particular talk about trying to figure out what the standards might be for how a partisan gerrymander violates people's First Amendment rights. So he's sending out a signal to people that work in this area that he wants to see more on that. And that it's a little bit like pornography. You know it when you see it, but how do we measure it? So some of the work that Common Cause is doing is we've started a gerrymander standard contest where we invite academics, citizens, and others to try and come up with the analysis and technology to show when maps are wildly askew and when it's a partisan gerrymander. And part of that is also getting the factual record and evidence about what their plan was. And in North Carolina, they nakedly admit what their plan was. And if they could have, they would have moved as many districts to Republicans as they could. But also how you can do that analysis. And so we have had many academics and scientists win that contest, and actually we've used their analysis in some legal cases we've been involved with, and one was a successful case in Virginia where they had a partisan gerrymander and the court struck that down. And so we believe the Supreme Court is willing and ready to look at this and look at a broader set of constitutional issues around it. And because we've brought a lawsuit also in Maryland on the same issue, we see this, whoever has power is engaged in this, and the technology has made it advance. But I think the strongest case we have is here in North Carolina, and I think we're going to be successful.
It's very hopeful news. Let me walk over here to start with David Glenn and work our way around the room.
Most interesting. Could you tell us how Common Cause is positioning itself to and in opposition to ALEC?
Yes. Actually, tomorrow we're going to be doing, releasing a new addendum to our whistleblower complaint with the IRS. One of the things that we have gone after about ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, is that they've masqueraded as a nonprofit, a C3, where corporations can give tax-deductible contributions to the American Legislative Exchange Council, and that they don't do lobbying. And we have had a number of activists and others share with us memos that they send to committees in state legislatures, and we saw a lot from Ohio, for instance, that literally said, here's how you should vote on these measures. And their agenda is about the corporate members' bottom line. And so we have filed this whistleblower complaint. The IRS takes a very long time looking at this kind of thing. But the attorney that we hired to work on this said it was the strongest whistleblower case that he's ever seen go to the IRS. And so tomorrow, my press person would kill me talking about this ahead of the release, but it is talking about how Exxon has funneled a lot of money to ALEC to be targeting environmental measures at the state level and also advancing their climate denying
Wonderful
work. But we also, one of the other challenges with ALEC, as we've also been involved in a campaign to get corporations to step away from ALEC, and dozens and dozens of corporations have stepped off the ALEC board. But ALEC is also, they form other groups. So there's a state policy network that is doing work, and so they just continue to morph and figure out new ways to engage in the bottom line of advancing corporate interests. And so we have to continually monitor and work on it.
So we're all sworn to secrecy on that release.
That's right.
Nobody can release anything.
We're doing a press conference tomorrow.
I want to come back to a point you made right at the beginning about what you called asymmetrical polarization. And I think that's a very useful phrase, because I think you're absolutely right. When we listen to sort of the quote-unquote mainstream media, they feel they have to bend over backwards to say, well, the Democratic Party has shifted left,
Right.
the Republicans right, as if it's an equivalence, and it really isn't. And so, I guess a kind of two-part question. Mm-hmm. One is, how do we help the public understand what this asymmetric polarization is without just engaging in sort of crude partisan bashing? And the second is, I think there's a very strong correlation between that shift and a kind of very crude win-at-all-costs sort of attitude that's also happening, I think, especially on the right. Now, someone on the left, even more so on the right. And I teach history, so I know that win-at-all-costs has been in American politics since the Hamiltonians, the
Right.
Jeffersonians, but it seems so much more so today, particularly with things like voter suppression. Mm-hmm. There's this idea that we just want to win and we don't care how we win, and if it means warping basic democratic rights with a small d, well then okay, because we know justice and God are on our side and we have to win because we have to win. And I think that's linked to the polarization, but how do we get the public to understand that
Right.
without just being accused of being partisan, quote unquote?
Right. So one, the asymmetrical polarization term doesn't come from me. You should read a book by Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann called "It's Worse Than It Looks." And then they came out with another one that it's much worse than it looks. And these are two middle-of-the-road scholars, that have, they're not left-wing scholars at the Brookings Institution talking about this and measuring how the right has moved so far right And, we've seen polarization, but there has been a fundamental shift. I think one of the challenges around that fundamental shift is you have to also look at the role of money. And the Koch brothers that have invested in some of those messengers, whether it is in university and endowed chairs, whether it is investing in the Tea Party movement, so that kind of framing is out there. And one of the challenges I also think we have around voting issues is the vitriolic language and accusations that Democrats are engaged in in-person voter fraud. And so it becomes a justification, that people are voting dozens of times in states and committing that kind of fraud, even though studies show you that really doesn't happen. So that creates and we see this kind of, these accusations and news sites that aren't actually news sites. They're online, they don't do the fact checking that they need to, and they just throw lies out there, and it happens on the left too. They throw things out there with any kind of fact checking. And you can link that also to the real challenges we face in media, where we see, newspapers and other media outlets don't have the ability to keep on staff. So you see cuts happening in state capitals and newspapers around the country. The most seasoned veteran reporters who have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge in the areas that they cover are gone, and they hire young people who don't know. And they have this notion of, I have to show both sides of the story, and they don't have the ability to check the facts either. So presenting it as one side versus the other, and they're both, what they're spouting is equally relevant, is a problem. I don't know if that answers it enough. I don't have the solutions, but I can certainly talk about some of the challenges. But I do think investing in a robust, media infrastructure is extremely important.
Let's go to Dennis first.
Karen, you were talking about the rising electorate, and I think all of us in this room know that as of this election, the millennials will be the largest voting bloc, displacing us baby boomers. Now, I'll give a plug for what we're doing here that you know. We have this voting guide that we're doing with Democracy NC and the NAACP that you'll see around everywhere. But Brian, working hard, even today working hard in the back, he's converted it to a mobile app. So people can put it in their address and their zip code, and they can get all this information. Well, my question is, what else can be done to engage these very important, very nonpartisan voters who are going to really influence it going forward?
A couple of things, and one is the Bernie phenomenon was very interesting because we saw that his messaging around democracy reform and much of the work that many of us do really resonated with young people. And one of the challenges for an organization like Common Cause and many others, and I will confess, the average age of a Common Cause member is probably around 70. So we have work to do, and it's one of the reasons that we have invested in bringing in digital staff that will communicate on platforms where young people go. I don't know about you, but if I try and reach my kids, and I have 4 boys, by email, they don't read email. That is not where they're engaging. They text, they're on Snapchat, they also think Facebook. Many of them have moved off Facebook. They're on Instagram, they're on Twitter. We need to be engaging and speaking to people where they are. And if we're speaking and we're not on those platforms, they don't hear us. And so, and increasingly, we see young people get most of their information from those mobile devices. And in fact, large swaths of our population, Latino voters and others, that's the device that you need to be reaching them on. So if you're doing action, you need to do it on mobile sites. And we've invested in spending a lot of work building our list of activists that are far younger and that engage in some of these issues. And so that investment, our goal is to grow in the millions. And we've done it by taking news that breaks immediately, connecting it to an action that people can take, and connecting it to campaigns that are happening in real time. And one of the benefits we have, we will be working on several campaigns at the federal level and have states that are working on many campaigns. So we could have 20 campaigns at any one time where we can connect people on the ground to doing real activism and work, like in North Carolina around gerrymandering. And then our North Carolina chapter has a tremendous program engaging at HBCUs and engaging students year-round around civic engagement and how they can engage in issues. Right now, it's about registering people to vote and encouraging them to vote, but also engaging them in work on gerrymandering and other campaigns that we have. And many of our other states do that as well.
One of the things that seems true to me is that lots of ordinary folks' engagement with the process of democracy is through the mechanics of elections and voting. So they're not privy to these kinds of conversations regularly, for example, but by watching conversations and debates and things that take place in neighborhoods that relate to campaigns. And I'm not naive to the fact that there have always been hard-fought, emotional campaigns, but it seems to me that in this particular election cycle, the bottom in terms of civility has almost dropped out completely. And so there's, I feel like I noticed like fewer bumper stickers. I suspect because people are kind of nervous about even declaring their opinions publicly or their intentions publicly. It's hard to have conversations with people in the community across ideologies and stuff. So I wonder if you fear that for young voters and even younger people who are growing up in this sort of new paradigm, that they're losing a sense of the more ideal, more functional way that a democracy works?
I do, and I will tell you, and all of you, I'm sure, have felt this at one time or another. I cannot believe what I hear coming out of candidates' mouths about our democracy, about the other side. Facts don't matter in some cases, and it's very dangerous. And I do think that one of the challenges we're seeing are that young people are not excited about the election at the top of the ticket, and I think it can depress turnout and engagement. I think it's a very real danger. And also, how do you engage them in looking at the rest of the ballot? I mean, in some states there's ballot initiatives that are extremely important that are out there on public issues. There are races that affect what happens with their schools and many other things that people aren't looking at. And that is some of the strategies we are trying to use this election to talk about. How do we get them to engage? So you don't like the presidential election? Let's talk about the down ticket races and how this can affect your lives. I do think it's a real challenge. And another challenge that I think we face is that we have a presidential candidate that says, if I don't win, it means the elections were rigged, and throws out there, the entire integrity of our voting system. It's enormously damaging. And, one of the things we're doing is reaching out to election officials that can say that is bull, and talking about that post-election. The challenge is you don't know where it's going to happen. He's talking about Pennsylvania, but who knows what state he may declare that about, or he could declare it about all of them. And so it is, there's no roadmap for where we are right now. I do think it presents real challenges, but I also think that that there are a lot of people who have been disgusted by that and more willing to engage. But I think young people, we have special challenges, and we need to talk about more than the top of the ticket and what's at stake for their lives.
I was going to add on that note, there was a very encouraging article the other day on the website of the Center for American Progress, in which one of their experts, I think, offered some real good advice to the community that's very concerned about, for instance, climate change, the environmental advocacy community. And he said what the environmental advocacy community can learn from the LGBTQ community. And what they can learn is that we have to talk about this stuff. We can't retreat and be fearful and go into our shells. And it's the enormous progress that we've made in our country in recent years in equality, although we have such a long way still to go, is basically a byproduct of people not being fearful anymore. It's a byproduct of people being honest and speaking up and talking about the subject and sharing openly and demystifying the topic for people. And that's what we need to do on climate change, what we need to do on democracy matters. That's sort of the position that we espouse at NC Policy Watch, that as painful as these debates and discussions sometimes are, maybe even a little scary, the alternative of simply retreating into our shells is no solution. And we have to engage, we have to continue to speak up and trust in the fact that the majority of the people want to do the right thing and that number will continue to grow.
I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that separation of powers doesn't work. The system has been broken from the beginning. It was not Madison's plan. It was the only way to get the Constitution to let the small states have equal representation in the Senate. But I think people ought to think about the fact that the only countries that have followed our example, and we were the first, arguably, aside from slaves and women, we were the first republic.
Aside from us.
Yeah. But nobody, who followed our example? Liberia and some Latin American countries. Nobody else. Nobody else. Duh. We got it right, and all the Western Europeans and the Japanese and the Australians, et cetera, got it wrong? No. But so I wanted to comment on two things points you were making too. That, I think you're exactly right that there's some hope that the Supreme Court is going to do the right thing. Damned important if we get 51 senators who will prove it. But the other thing is that talking about, we need to really educate people about the actual character of the system and why it doesn't work well.
Right.
And it's also the focus on the states. But the Supreme Court did us the service, starting with the decision in 1957 to eliminate the problem that we have with the U.S. Senate and state legislatures. I think if we can work at the state level and if we can educate people, and the Supreme Court helps us out a bit, then we have some reason for optimism. But by and large, I don't see much reason for optimism with separation of powers is not going to change, because we've indoctrinated ourselves to thinking, by golly, we've got the best system in the world, Separation of powers really works. It doesn't.
All right, well, that was a very lengthy question. And I know our time is short, but Karen, perhaps that will provoke a few last thoughts where we stand.
One of the things that struck me, and I think that's really interesting, I think that as Common Cause, as a democracy movement, I think that we have clearly made a strong case for what doesn't work in our democracy. The issues, more people than ever know about the problems of money in politics, the breakdown at between Congress and the president. We have talked about the problems in ways that has created huge amounts of cynicism. What I don't think we've done well is to tell the stories of when things work. when reforms make a difference. And even the Connecticut experience, I will give talks and talk about it, but that is not out there. People wouldn't know about what we did in Connecticut because, one, there hasn't been any money to tell a real story about that, but we just haven't done it. And so we can't just engage in the fear and here's all that's broken. I think that we need to show that there are people that will take principled stands to move democracy reform and break down barriers to participation, and we need to show examples of how that can work. And there are many of them, and most of them at the state level. And we have to do a better job of doing that, which wasn't exactly your point, but it did remind me that that's something we need to do.
Amen to that. Okay, let's go. One last question in the back there, Allison. Do you have?
Yeah, I can project my voice. I just wanted to know, I come from a public education standpoint, and I wanted to know what kind of coalition you're building to combat the dismantling of public schools. Because I feel like our democracy rests on an educated electorate, and there's a push from the extreme right to dismantle public education and do away with our means to educate people about, we don't have a separation of power so much as we have a balance of power, and that's what has fallen apart. So,
Right.
What are your efforts for building or being in coalition on that front?
It's something we haven't worked on, but I agree with you completely that assault is a real danger to our democracy. And for us, it's just a matter of bandwidth and expertise, but completely supportive of those efforts. It's just not something that we've had the ability to work on. Actually, we also are concerned about the lack of civics taught in our schools, the kinds of things we were taught.
Inaccurate civics.
Well, and there is some, right, there's some textbooks making their way through Texas and other places that are completely inaccurate.
That's another one to add to the list.
Yeah.
Well, join me on thanking Carrie.